Oh, yeah. Welcome. Another episode of Indie Podcast, hosted by Shiro and Mehreen. My name is Shiro Nobunaga, intuitive counselor, and our beautiful co-host, Mehreen, the Oracle.
Hello.
Presented by Guided Soul-ution. And we are presenting live from Creative Box Studio in Ontario. The music that you are hearing, written by User One Music, and brought to you by Lost Cause Media as well. So in this episode, we're gonna, as we all do, we always do, go in deep with various topics. And we speak sometimes very deeply, and sometimes we speak candidly about it. Our first episode was about toxic positivity. It was really fun. And then the second episode we did, it was about forgiveness. What does forgiveness look like? So if you guys missed it, please do tune in. All of the episodes are currently live on YouTube, as you guys are watching live right now on Twitch. So today, Mehreen, I want to talk about trust.
It's a big one.
That's a big one, right? I feel that that is definitely a lot of what comes through in the topic with my sessions with clients. And it's something that we observe all over the world, right? I mean, issues with trust. What is it that who can we trust? What can we trust? A lot of things are built on trust, they say. And the loss of trust and how detrimental that is, right? It creates a lot of phenomena.
It's tied into so much. I mean, feeling betrayed,
Yeah.
feeling abandoned,
Yeah.
or victimized. I mean, it's really, to me, that foundation emotion that just is really the current that runs through a lot.
Yeah, I like how you, those adjectives just kind of
Thanks.
rolled off your mouth with so much heartfelt. Felt like it was very real to you.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
We'll get into it.
Okay. So, and I know a lot of listeners out there are also dealing with trust issues in a lot of different areas in their lives. And so there are a lot of things that I'd like to share from the sessions and a lot of the divine wisdom that I felt came through. But at the same time, how I've observed trust being defined and interpreted. But before we get into that, just tell me what does trust? What are some of the experiences around trust or any loss of their trust in your life?
I mean, definitely, trust to me means being able to rely on something.
Yeah.
And in all of the instances where I felt that there's been a loss of trust, I felt abandoned. I mean, all of those terms I used earlier, you feel abandoned or victimized or shamed, and you believed, in somebody or something, and then your expectations weren't met.
Right.
And so even with myself, and self-trust, it's really just a matter of realizing what those expectations are, realizing that I can't necessarily put my satisfaction and happiness outside of myself, because that's just endless variables I can never control, and how to bring it back into myself and own it fully.
So, and you don't have to obviously go into specifics unless you want to, but in regards to like betrayal, for example, what are some scenarios that you can recall, or even just what you observed with friends or whatever? What are some instances of betrayal of trust?
I mean, I think one that most people will resonate with is, being in a relationship. And one of my most first significant long-term relationships, it was this beautiful fairy tale. Everything was wonderful and hunky-dory, and you think it's all good. You're kind of in this beautiful rose-colored glasses world, and then was basically just repeatedly cheated on. He ended up being married with a whole family, and that definitely pulled the rug out from under my feet. Wasn't expecting that. The trust that I had and what the relationship was and where it was going.
Right.
The expectations, I guess, that I had put on it. Not wrongly so. It's pretty
Right.
normal to just kind of assume you're not going to be treated like crap.
Right.
That was pretty much that first just head-on sort of collision with what a loss of trust felt like in a big tangible way.
So in a situation like that, which, you know, I often hear that kind of stories, right? I mean, it's a making for a lot of drama as well. Like a lot of great stories include scenarios like that because it's so common. Let's go in deep with this.
Okay.
So in a situation like that, like what is it that you're actually trusting? Where is that trust placed?
For me, it was the empathy of don't do things to me that you know wouldn't feel good, you know, wouldn't just make me feel less than. Yeah, empathy really is that big common thread that really runs through why I get so hurt in every sort of dynamic, because I think I do a pretty good job on fostering that with other people, with myself, and trying to see things from their point of view and, you know, walk a mile in their shoes, all of that shit. And in that case, I was like, you were so grossly just off of, you know, from what you thought or what I wanted. And how could you have just not known me well enough to know that this wouldn't be okay? How could you not just feel shitty for doing this? It's not even remotely close to what I was expecting.
So in that instance, you're saying that you trusted in his awareness or intent?
Definitely in the awareness of how
what?
I would want to be treated. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So in other words, you trusted that he would know better than to do something that would cause you to feel disappointed. Does that summarize it?
Trusting his judgment, you know, and I guess intentions too, in a way.
Okay.
That, you know.
That's pretty tricky, right? Because intention and judgment is different. Because, and I can, I guess, maybe speak from a guy's point of view, they may not always intend on making you feel that way, right? I mean, there are definitely some people that may intend to do so, but most instances like that, because that's I'm sure, quite common type of experience within intimate relationships. And whether it was, you know, doesn't have to be necessarily married, but maybe they had a girlfriend, or that they were cheating, weren't being faithful. All of that is a lot of association to loss of trust. But if we were to say that their intent was questionable, that may be a whole different field, because intention says that I want to hurt the person that I'm with by hiding this information, correct? So in some ways, the trust that triggered the heartbreak was more in the actual leakage or exposure or the outcome of the information that was not pleasing to the partner. Would that be better capturing the whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also layers to it sometime. And
yes.
I'm totally over it now, so definitely it's I think if you talked to me about it 5 years ago, I'd be a lot more just hurt and upset. And I'm like, no, his intentions were terrible too. He wanted to hurt me, but
right. But in hindsight now.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's like, you know, if I'm trusting you with just full access to my heart, then that means I'm expecting you to act in a way that won't hurt me. And you're kind of relying on someone to fully understand what that is. And there's some things that seem like it's just universally wrong, but it's so unique to everybody.
It is.
And to the culture that you're in. And your own arrangement.
Right.
So, yeah, it's definitely messy.
It's also greatly hinging on, like, did you have that conversation?
No.
in the beginning of
Yeah,
the relationship.
I mean, as far as like being exclusive, sure, but the whole, having a whole wife and kids set
Right.
up, behind the scenes.
So this person, no doubt, lied
Yeah.
or hid
Yeah.
essential information.
Yeah.
Now, it's possible that this person didn't have the intention to do so from the get-go, could have, but even then it's this whole, how do I say this to someone that I'm feeling so much for, and this person is probably aware of his own rules that he's breaking, whatever. So it doesn't necessarily negate from this person's inner struggle about the whole process of hiding that information.
Yeah. I mean, he's also a bit of a sociopath too. So the lack of, and I mean, truly, it's something he's admitted to as well, but the lack of empathy and remorse,
Okay.
you know? So,
Okay, so
yeah, what I was speaking to of, I've tried to anticipate people's expectations
Yes.
and wants and needs.
Yes.
And I want to make sure that my actions don't impede on that.
yes.
And for him, he just literally can't do that.
Right.
So it's like, it's not even your fault. You're so
Okay,
hurtful.
so then it's hard to, so in other words, you weren't aware of that nature or that condition or state.
No, at
that
first
he-
it was just charming and
Right.
wow, you know exactly what to
Right.
say to win me over.
The
and it's-
hunter, right?
Totally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so and you were consumed in the sales pitch, in other words, and you bought it. You
Yeah.
bought the product.
I mean, and to add another layer of confusion, like we recognized each other from a past life.
Oh,
and
yeah.
There was that sort of immediate
the
connection.
immediate
so
sense
there
of
was
connection.
that trust of,
Okay.
I know you,
Right.
know, but I don't really know you.
Well, okay. So again,
Complicated.
you kind of see in this context of the conversation that when I ask, like, where did you place your trust? Because a lot of people use this word trust, but trust is actually a very specific, targeted action. And when I have a lot of clients coming to me, right, saying, I was in a great relationship and this happened and my trust was betrayed. And with it, the whole faith in mankind is questioned in this person. The how can I ever trust another? How can I ever open myself up to someone? Okay, so that is absolutely devastating experience to have, as I have. I've been on both situations, so I kind of see both sides of the coin pretty well in that regard, I guess, because I have been in position where my actions have broken hearts, and then I have been in positions where other people's actions have broken hearts. And there are a lot of ways to express that, and betrayal of trust is definitely one that I can use. But when you really, really start to look at the fiber, the makeup of the energy and the action and the intent of trust, we begin to realize that we're actually very ambiguous about what it is that we're even saying we trust.
Definitely.
And there are times where it comes out in the session that, well, okay, you trusted that this person will be faithful. And this person may have even promised to not to be faithful. And in that, it is definitely right to say, oh, you betrayed my trust. The agreement was broken, or this person made a mistake. There are a lot of different situations, even with the unfaithful action, for example, right? Because I don't want to really put a lot of focus on just that, because loss of trust happens in many different ways. But let's talk about that one, because that's definitely close to home for a lot of us. Even with that, it could be, where was that relationship in regards to that person arriving to that action? Was this a person's need to fill a temporary dip of their ego and self-esteem? Or was this person actually falling in love with someone? Or there was a stronger connection? Was this person not communicating that there was a lack of connection or there was something that wasn't thriving anymore in the current relationship? All of that leads to someone's action like that, right? And so just to summarize that trust was betrayed is it literally ignores and disrespects the whole context of each other, right? Because if we were going to say that to somebody, then we also, because that's a powerful statement to make, one that when you make it, it immediately imprints in our psyche what that means to us, and then triggers the whole emotion of trauma. So we owe it to ourselves as well to really understand how did the so-called betrayal of trust actually occurred.
And do you think it's important to spend a lot of time, kind of ruminating why or how did they get here? Or do you just have to walk away from it and be like, all I can really do is just rely on the trust I have for myself, trusting my intuition to move past this and,
Well, you're definitely onto the higher level of consciousness at that point, because in the end, we kind of talked about that in forgiveness, is that the true embodiment of what forgiveness or the mechanism of forgiveness looks like is that in the end, we own that story. We recognize that there's some kind of a soul level agreement for someone to share an experience together, and therefore blaming someone else for that experience is literally us relinquishing our own self-empowerment. We're denying our sovereignty to say someone else took the power away, and therefore we become victims, and therefore forgiveness is not about pardoning the other person, but it's a restoration of our own owning of our story, right? So that is definitely the final and the most high, I guess the highest path that we can take is to bring trust back into ourselves. And I'm going to get to that. But I wanted to really definitely explore some of the very common pain and heartbreak and heartache and devastation that occurs around the whole point of experiencing betrayal of trust or loss of trust. And so, in a nutshell, when we talk about trust being betrayed with someone's action, oftentimes what I begin to see or observe in the conversation is that first, it's not trust. It was an expectation. That is very powerful to know the difference between betrayal of trust and disappointment of expectation.
Which isn't inherently bad, right? If you both agree to honor and respect these expectations.
Absolutely. But the disappointment of expectation does not bring that type of devastation to our emotion as loss of trust does. And it's really important to identify the difference, because in the end, a lot of times in these situations, when you trust someone else to behave a certain way, regardless of their agreement or acknowledgement, you are essentially forcing that person to only behave that way if they are to be qualified as trustworthy. That's actually something that we owe to balance, right? When we invest trust, we also have to remember the other balance is that we're also telling that person, you better not act any other way, because other ways will tell me you're not trustworthy. And it's not leaving room for that person's unintentional, perhaps, or something that derives from a different intent, but it doesn't leave room for that explanation, or it doesn't invite understanding, because trust already says, I don't give you any room to behave any other way.
It's very black and white.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it's very actually, and it's ultimately how we interpret everything we say that makes us feel a certain way. So that's why when we say trust, it's very important to really understand. That kind of leads me to kind of getting into the definition of trust. So I kind of pulled it up on the dictionary. The noun of trust, the first definition that comes is assured reliance on the character, ability, strength, or truth of someone or something. One in which confidence is placed. The number 2 definition says dependence on something future or contingent, like hope. Reliance on future payment for property and so forth. So it's a lot of what I'm picking up from that definition is that trust also literally equates to dependence.
On something outside of yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was kind of wanting to kind of go into the whole what we did with forgiveness in our previous episode, where we kind of broke it down to how how words or experience is interpreted at different dimensional consciousness. I mean, we use the 3-dimensional, 4th-dimensional, 5th-dimensional sort of, and again, the definition of 3D, 4D, and 5D is not so relevant, but just starting 3D as merely the physical reality experience. In a 3-dimensional reality experience, the physical reality experience, and believing that this is the only thing we have going on, which is often referred to as 3-dimensional. Trust is most often invested in something outside of us, right? I trust you, I trust the system, I trust in this agreement, I trust in his judgment, whatever it is. Trust is in the 3-dimensional sense, just again, generally speaking, most commonly invested in outside of ourselves. Would you agree?
I think that's the
anything
basic sort of definition that we all the surface
is there any other instances you can think of in that dimensional definition?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, like you would trust that law enforcement officer is meant to protect us, or anything
trusting
that is
the system to have your back, or
or your
healthcare is meant to help you.
Or trust your friends to have your back. So it's the word is used often to define a sense of comfort in depending or relying on something, whether it's character or word or anything else. Okay. And I'm using fourth dimension as sort of the transition to a level of higher consciousness. So again, it's not necessarily true definition by how people know the dimensional realities and so forth. I'm just kind of using that as a categorical difference. So fourth dimension is when we begin to develop trust, something that is beyond our physical reality, like religion, for example, which is faith, right? The word faith is something, even though the mechanism trust is pretty much the same, the definition of faith, as I looked it up in the dictionary, would say allegiance to duty or a person, loyalty, fidelity to one's promises, sincerity of intentions, and of course, this is the part that I think is more what I was trying to allude to. Number 2 is belief and trust in loyalty to God. Belief in the traditional doctrines of religion and things like that. So in other words, and I think there was another one, a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. So I think that's the most powerful contrast to trust. It takes it another level, right? It's
it's
trust.
not quite tangible.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no agreement. There's no promises. And there's no way to vet this process, right? This trust, when it converts into the word faith, the element of trust is still there. But now we're believing in something that we don't have proof that it exists, something that we call higher power, something like that. And then when we take it another step higher, this is what you mentioned, which is self-trust. And in that self-trust is something that I want to definitely save for later. And you can cough if you like, Mehreen.
Okay.
Yes. I don't want you to
See
start.
my eyes getting
Yeah, I
all
know
red.
your eyes are getting teary. I just like, don't hold back. Don't worry. Nobody is judging us for coughing on the microphone.
I think I'm traumatized to cough these days with COVID.
Maybe
I
that's
coughed
what
at
it is.
Trader Joe's the other day.
That's
and
right.
like 10 people just turned around and looked at me and glared, and I was like, all right, let me just hurry up and get out of here as fast as possible.
You're right. I am aware and more nervous to cough in public as well. But here it's safe, so don't worry.
You. So 5D.
Yeah, so the highest form of trust, and again, everything, as you know, in this indie podcast and for you and I, is all about observation, what we observed, what our thoughts are. It's never necessarily an absolute representation of anything absolute.
These are just our opinions.
And interpretation.
Yeah.
But the highest form is to trust in yourself. Now, here's why. Because in the end, my mom used to always say to me, don't ever trust anything that breathes in from their nose and mouth.
All right.
Yeah. She's trying to say trust only in God.
Yeah.
Okay. So in this definition of self-trust, it's not at the face value. It sounds like it's very ego-driven, right? It's very egotistical to go, I only trust myself, right? But it's really in the context of how you say this. So in this definition, I'm saying it in a sense of most divine sense of trust in self, meaning that the self is connected to the divine, the self that even in religion, for example, in the biblical religion, it will be acknowledging the kingdom of God is within you. So God is within you. So trusting in yourself is equivalent to trusting in God. That there is a difference even in that, because earlier in the fourth dimension I mentioned about faith, and a lot of people have faith in God, but they don't have faith in themselves.
Well, they still see that separation.
Because there's a separate sense of separation.
Yeah.
We're not as good as, or God is perfect and I'm not, right? Okay, so we're not acknowledging ourselves as a divine being at that point. Okay, so that there is a shift. That's why self-trust is acknowledging that we are the extension of the divine. So that makes the whole world of difference in the shifting of even the definition and the interpretation and the experience of trust.
Layers. But it's, even just defining a word now with this multifaceted view of, in 3D, it kind of means this, and 4 and 5, and
Well, yes.
you just go deeper into it.
Because what we do in assisting others with reaching clarity or healing, right? What we do intuitively for others is to really help that person break through from whatever dilemma that they're experiencing in any form. So when we counsel people, if we don't have the awareness of the subtle vibrational difference of every interpretation that people hold behind what they're saying, then we wouldn't be effective in our depth of counsel that we can provide. Would that be correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so a lot of this is not necessarily forcing someone to see something that I understand it as so, but I'm sharing what I've observed in regards to how people use word trust. And because when you say betrayal of trust, there's an immediate subconscious permission to go, oh yeah, you can feel very shitty and you have the right to be very pissed off, and you don't ever have to forgive this person, and this person doesn't deserve any room for understanding. All of those things flood in from that permission that occurs in the instant that they say to themselves, this person betrayed my trust. And when I stop and say, even though it may look right for you guys to say that to trust someone to be faithful is absolutely normal and natural, it's still something that you expected. Even if the person agreed to be faithful, it's an expectation that was disappointed. That doesn't necessarily mean it feels better, but it does change the dynamics of how we process that experience when we identify it as what really is. Because in the end, how can anybody trust anyone who has their own will, own sentience, their own accumulated lifetimes, if just even within their own this current life, accumulated stories that built up from their childhood that you can't say that you have thoroughly studied, researched, interviewed, and understand and respect, and then to say that you trust that person to behave a certain way.
I mean, we barely understand ourselves and our
Exactly.
experiences and
Exactly.
motives, so
Yes.
totally.
So, in the end, what compels us to want to trust?
I mean, for me personally, going through just various experiences, I mean, outside of relationships, romantically, but even in the workplace or with friends, and you have that feeling of trust being betrayed. One of my exercises I like to do is to be a bit of a narcissist, but consciously. So I make everything a mirror, and I'm like, okay, I'm not upset that this person betrayed my trust. I betrayed my own trust. Why didn't I trust my own intuition in this situation? I had a feeling and I just ignored it, and I went through, and what I was afraid of, what would happen happened.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, for me, just relying on my own sort of inner compass and being able to trust myself, which is actually the hardest thing to do. It's easy to just pass it out to everybody that I meet, or to the people that I'm in a relationship with, or it makes it sound like it's multiple people at once. Definitely not. And what a hypocrite, right? But yeah, I mean, just making sure that my just full semblance of self-trust and keeping that power inside of myself, and not just giving it away. And, because everyone, you're right, everyone's on their own journey. They've got their own motives. They've got their own wounds that they're acting out from.
Even with the greatest intention to the person.
They just, I mean, half of us don't even know why we are the way we are, right? So, you're asking someone to be fully conscious of every decision they make, and every bit of trauma that they're acting out from. And it's not realistic. We're human.
So would you say that's why we want to trust others? We tend to want to trust,
It's
or
easier to look
for things
outside
to
of
trust?
ourselves, right?
So
Yeah.
what are you saying?
It's
ultimately?
easier to look outside of ourselves to trust, because really we're lacking our own self-trust.
Ow!
Guilty.
Yeah. That's deep, baby. In deep, as we say. Yes, absolutely. In the end, our desire to put trust outside of ourselves is because we don't trust ourselves enough, and we want somebody else to do it for us.
It's easier, right? I
Yes.
don't have to look at myself and hold my own, soul accountable for the decisions I make, because everyone's too busy betraying my trust, and I've got to go deal with all those little fires instead
Right.
of just getting down to the systemic
Right.
issue of trusting my own discernment.
Yeah. Now, let us not go veer off to make it sound like to be hurt by somebody's unfaithful action is wrong, because that's not what we're saying here, right? It's still gonna hurt, because love desires that exclusivity. Love desires to hoard every part of that person that we love, and we don't like to see that love being turned or given or shared with someone else.
Totally.
Jealousy is we can get into jealousy for a lot
Yeah.
that's a lot of layers too, but
Yeah.
there is definitely a natural phenomena of jealousy that occurs. So absolutely, only thing we're talking about is to define or conclude it as a betrayal of trust, because that's where it gets tricky. So when we want someone to be faithful, it's just a matter of at least understanding from the get-go that it is an expectation, right? It can never become a rule, because in that regard, obviously, I know that men are definitely more known and more seemingly prone, right, to be unfaithful, but unfaithful actions are obviously doesn't discriminate to gender, obviously, so it happens. So let's talk on a universal level, that's a whole phenomena that deserves a deep look as to every case, because every case is different too, and why people do it, and all of that matters to how the other person feels too. It's just that when we say betrayal of trust and we conclude that this trust was broken, and that gives ourselves the permission to absolutely ignore the rest of this person's whole entire being and story behind their action, that's when we got to say, hey, wait a minute. This is not about trust, because how can you ever trust in someone else to behave the way you wanted them to? You can train the dog to be as faithful as possible, but even then, it's every time they answer to your call, it isn't a trust. It is every instance deserves gratitude and respect that they responded the way you trained them to. In other words, just because they didn't act the way you trained them to, you wouldn't interpret that as you betrayed my trust. Because, again, you acknowledge it. Why is it more lenient with animals? Because we think animals don't know any better. They're more wild in nature, and therefore there's room for that kind of mistake. So then the expectation was more lenient, and we don't call it
Interesting.
trust.
Yeah. I never thought about it that way, but
Right?
yeah.
Okay, so every person deserves, or not deserves, in the most highest form of free will, in the end, has the right to act the way they want to. If they saw that this act of unfaithfulness, or this act that is a betrayal of trust, was something that they regarded as more value, even if they regret it later and admit that it's a mistake or whatever. It was their own sentient decision and choice. And there's no way to hold somebody down in the name of trust. So sometimes the word is used to actually control someone's behavior.
It's a lot of food for thought, yeah.
So that's why I was kind of like, oftentimes with that situation where it's like, okay, in the end, what my mother was saying to me, and it's true, right? Only thing you can trust is something beyond yourself. In religious terms, it would be God. Because why? In our definition of God in that kind of religious context is that we assume that God is absolutely perfect in every way. So it's easy to just trust something because even if it goes in a direction that we don't expect it or that we don't like, we trust that there is some kind of higher wisdom at play. That's what faith in God really means, right?
Yeah, I feel like I rarely see that though also, and that's a bit of a tangent, but it's really easy to have faith when life is going great and in the context of God specifically. But I've experienced people losing that the second something bad happens, right? Like, why did God do this to me?
And of course,
what was the purpose?
The sermon or the teaching that comes forth with that is that our faith is being tested or refined and so forth. But that's easy because we go with the assumption that it's blemish-free, something perfect. But at least it does establish that it isn't natural for us to trust in something outside of ourselves, outside of our control. If we know that even we can't trust ourselves because, like you said, we don't know sometimes why we do certain things. Do we always act the way we trusted ourselves to act? Do we always act the way we expect ourselves to act? No. Then how can we trust anything outside of ourselves, which exists pretty much on the same level playing field? So, in that sense of trust in a relationship, if I were to say, Mehreen, I trust you, what I'm really saying in the end, and how it would best serve us to interpret, is to say, I trust in my discernment or judgment that you and I are meant to connect and share a journey or season together.
You're really just saying you trust yourself, which is what we should always be aiming for, in my opinion.
And so anytime, even when it's mutual connection, we're saying, I trust me to know that this sharing of this relationship has a purpose for me, and you're saying the same thing about that. That's a mutual trust, but the placement of trust didn't veer off the alignment.
And it just seems like there's so much more freedom in an interaction like that too, because the expectations are just not there.
Well, it's at least flexible.
Yeah, definitely.
At least we can admit to expectations, but it doesn't give the level of condemnation that it could come when the expectation is not met. Some people can hold expectation at a very strict and high level, that I will say. And with that, disappointment is just as great when it's not met. But it's still different than loss of trust and the phenomena that it creates from it.
Have there been any instances where you've just lost trust in yourself?
So, thank you for actually triggering that. I was trying to recall like different moments where I lost trust, first and foremost, outside of myself, like the kind of experiences you had, right? It's really hard for me to recall loss of trust, but yes, there are times where when I thought this person was a good friend of mine and caught them saying something behind my back,
It hurts.
right?
Yeah.
Or saying something or making fun of something that I thought this person wouldn't make fun of, let's say, for example. And then the sense of there's always this doubt that I guess this person is always thinking that way about me, right? That is a close phenomenon to loss of trust, I guess.
And even that is so triggering because I think we've all experienced that. But what's most disturbing about that to me is it's less about them thinking that, around me and more so, have they always felt this way and I've just never noticed it and I've been oblivious to a facet of their personality or, their treatment of me. And then so it kind of comes back to just my own trust and my judgment of character and situations that I feel like I should not be a part of sometimes or environments, etc.
Right.
Which, I mean, it's hard, right? Once you're aware of how...
Well, you're literally starting to walk on eggshells at that point, right? And it takes away that comfort. So the sense of trust is a sense of comfort, a sense of not needing to question or doubt safety of being in that space with that person. And so again, I mean, loss of trust when it is invested in something outside of yourself, it is devastating. It creates a whole, it changes everything. The dynamics of what you were comfortable with completely goes away.
But can we get to a point where it's not so devastating and it's just, this all happens for a reason and this is just their expression of experiences and trusting that it's all for divine purpose. There's no random accidents. It's all slight pivots and maneuvers to ultimately get to wherever we need to go. So,
can we? And that's a great question.
It brings me back to faith too.
Yeah, I mean, that will be something that I would definitely call out to everyone that's listening to this. Can we get to a place where we don't necessarily have to say we trust one another to be able to feel comfortable and safe? Can we just be open and honest about even if it's an expectation that we're holding, that it's just an expectation that I have? Is it okay to have that expectation? Sure. And for the other person to say, I would intend and want to be at that place that you, or the person that you expect me to be. But there has to be also with an expectation, if that expectation is disappointed or betrayed for that matter, or broken, it doesn't have to completely deconstruct the bond of trust.
I mean, I see those moments as a bit of a, like the arrow being pulled backwards and it feels really awful. But then that in that interaction where somebody feels like they let down their significant other or whatever, if their intention and awareness is that of, you know what, I haven't really shown up in the way that I want to, show up in this relationship or partnership or agreement or whatever.
Yeah.
And when I see people do that and hold themselves accountable, and yes, that exact situation is maybe heartbreaking or your trust has been betrayed or whatever you want to call it. But when you see them step up and then pivot in a direction that is just more positive for that partnership, it builds more trust, even though that exact micro moment is hard to kind of experience. Right. But sometimes it's just a great catalyst too. So
it is. Yes, you're right.
These experiences feel pretty heartbreaking when you're in them.
Yeah.
But in the grand scheme of it, it does kind of take you to those higher levels of just deeper intimacy, even just on an emotional level.
Absolutely. And I think that at that level, what you're really trusting is in the bond.
Yeah.
You're trusting in the purpose. You're trusting in the connection. That's still, you see how subtly, but it's different than trusting the other person to behave a certain way. That's when it becomes codependent. You're relinquishing a part of your own sovereignty, and you're creating a reliance of your sense of safety on that person's behavior. It's different when you go, you know what, this whatever experience we have, even when it hurts me or you, I trust in this bond and the purpose that we're serving for each other, or that there's a sense of divine script or any kind of soulmate connection,
It's
whatever
just
it is.
having faith in something that you maybe
I
can't
believe
see
in
that
this
moment.
friendship. That's another way to express it, right? Then that's different. And that is definitely a better form of trust, because you're not putting it on somebody. That's different, because you're now sharing in the accountability together. So when I say I trust in our friendship, it's acknowledging the need for me to trust myself and to trust in the synergy that this bond creates. But ultimately, if it's no longer creating whatever trust that you put into that bond, then you are not necessarily losing trust in the bond. You are recognizing that the bond is no longer what it used to be. Expiration, end of season, so forth.
Which is totally fine. you know?
Absolutely.
It's fulfilled whatever it needed to. That season's just not, exhausted makes it sound like you end on a bad note. but
Right.
sometimes those interactions are just meant to happen for a short amount of time, but the quality of it is so strong that you both hopefully leave feeling fulfilled and satisfied and
Yeah.
better than when you started.
Yeah. And it's tough because we want to trust in something forever, long term. Why? Because we're conditioned to mourn endings, right? We celebrate beginnings far more than endings. And most endings are mourned: breakups, divorces, and death, right? Only endings we truly celebrate is graduation and retirement, perhaps, maybe. There aren't a lot of endings that we celebrate, because why? Overall, we are conditioned and programmed to mourn or interpret endings as bad or negative. Even though, how do you have any kind of beginnings without an ending? So any beginning comes with an ending. I kind of did a whole episode on closure, because how do you celebrate beginnings without properly celebrating an ending of something?
That's so true. I've never thought about it that way. I have a hard time with closure, saying goodbye and endings. I mean, even when a show, hits that finale, I'm devastated for weeks.
Yeah,
So,
I know.
But then
me
how do I
too.
start my next show, right? My next marathon on Netflix. So you're right. It's all perspective. Thanks, Shiro.
Yeah.
It helps a lot.
It is. Yeah, when you love, for me, it was Friends. I loved Friends. And when it came to it, it was just like, what am I going to look forward to, right? But endings, it's, imagine for them, doing a whole 10-year, run of something that
Probably
over
kill
and
myself.
over and
It
over and
seems
over.
really sad.
Right?
Yeah.
Even though people may always want to see it continue, it has to end somewhere, right?
And
They ha-
speaking to the quality too, I think we've all had shows or movie, franchises where we're like, they should have stopped at the second one, and it's speaking to the season of
Right.
quality and interaction, and trusting that if this ends now, it's because
Yeah.
it needed to end now.
Yeah, we were just
Yeah.
talking about Game of Thrones, and when the ending is not fulfilling enough, that's when it's especially frustrating. God, why do they have to end it like that? Kind of thing.
I actually really liked how it ended for the most
Really?
part.
I thought it was really rushed.
The whole thing with Arya, I thought that was cool.
Yeah,
I
that's
actually threw my drink across the
Yeah.
room when she jumped out. I thought it was epic. I loved the Daenerys thing, unpopular opinion, but
Yeah.
it's okay.
But even from a just a objective point of view, it was pretty obvious that a lot of things was just crammed in there.
Yeah.
We knew it was worth more episodes, but it was just like let's just get it all in one, extended, but
Yeah.
one episode, right? They forced a lot of outcomes
It
too.
needed to end so we could all marathon manifest, new beginnings. So,
See, again, manifest, canceling before the finale. I mean, come on, right? The lack of closure of a story, it's frustrating.
we're clearly very triggered by this.
Yes.
Moving on.
Okay, moving on. I must check in with our producer to make sure we're not over time. Are we reaching the 5 minute? Okay, we're all right. So, with that said, so it's very interesting that when we talk about trusting someone else, we must keep in mind that it's borderline violation of free will. That sometimes we're totally discarding or disrespecting or not honoring their own depth of story that they're living from day to day that leads them to act a certain way.
I
And
agree.
we're only
yeah.
seen through the filter of what we wanted them to be.
Or what is the least wounding, course of action
Right.
for our needs.
Yeah.
And it really does handicap their experience overall.
And it saves us a
Yeah.
lot of lingering process if we can come to the conclusion, like you said, where we can go, you know what? Everything happens for a reason. And I own whatever outcome it was as something that I needed to experience for myself. Then in that trust, whether it's you say, I trust in my own soul script, or you trust that God orchestrated this for me to experience, that trust will take you to a higher, or at least more of a complete closure to the experience than to say, you betrayed my trust. And to acknowledge that our desire to trust in others ultimately comes from our lack of trust within ourselves, and there is a form of codependence, wanting someone else to do it for us.
Yeah, it's this subconscious need for balance. We feel that we lack trust in ourselves, because most of us do. I mean, even myself included, work in progress. And instead of just looking inwards and holding myself accountable, it's definitely much easier to be like, hey, you know what? I trust myself so, but you really should have had my back. I should have been able to trust you. And
Yeah,
it's a lot easier to
absolutely.
just project.
And I think that it's not about the performance aspect of it. It's just acknowledging that mechanism. At least then you go, okay, it's always mutually accountable experience, no matter what. And with that, but to the first episode, I really wanted to kind of help define trust in different levels, how we interpret trust, and what trust usually looks like. So as we take a break into our second episode, the part 2 of this trust series, I definitely like to go into what self-trust and what highest form of trust looks like and feels like. So
wait.
we'll be right back in deep with Shiro and Mehreen, part 1 of trust.